Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. I'm going to be real upfront with you guys. I am struggling this week. So I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but I am overcoming a minor cold, and thankfully it's a minor cold, like I take my blessings where I can get them, But yeah, hopefully I don't sound super nasally in this episode today. But also on top of that, this week I got poison ivy, so that has been not so great. Okay, I know I've talked about this somewhere in a previous episode, but I detest gardening. I'm not a gardener. I'm not good with plants. And what's crazy to me too is I prepared, I was like, I know what poison ivy looks like. I wore a long sleeve shirt, long pants, I thought I'm good. I'm covered, right? No. This is my lot in life, I think. I just have to look at poison ivy or be in the near vicinity of it because I, came inside, scrubbed my arms and legs, because I thought, I'm covered and there's no way that anything got under my sleeves or under the legs of my pants. But just in case, I was like, I'm gonna, do my due diligence, scrub every inch of my body, and yet here we are. I started as a mild itch on my elbow, and now it's just, spread. So, yeah, I guess I'm just never going to do yard work again. That's really the only logical solution here, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but every time I do yard work, I get poison ivy. So I don't know, but this is my cross to bear, not yours. But I can't be around plants anymore. Bad things happen, but you know what? That's fine. I never liked them anyway. So I'll try to keep the scratching to a minimum here, and we'll proceed with today's episode. And I hope wherever you're listening, whether you're in your car or you're working at a bakery at 2 or 3 a.m. Hey, Josh. Shout out to Josh. I hope you guys will enjoy this episode because we're going to be talking about the next book in the Nancy Drew series, The Twin Dilemma. So this is book number 63 in the Nancy Drew series, and it was first published in 1981. And I was actually able to find 4 separate covers for The Twin Dilemma. And if you guys ever want to check these out, I post them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays before these episodes come out on Thursday. So the first edition of this cover, it comes in a paperback edition, but if you're able to find it in a hardback cover, that's actually a little bit more rare and hard to find. I believe the later numbers of this series, from about number 57, The Tribble Hoax Mystery, up to Captive Witness, which is our next book we're going to be covering, number 64, those are very hard to find in the Flashlight hardcover edition, so if you ever see them when you're out, you should scoop them up. So on the cover of this book, we have Nancy standing in the street. She's kind of hiding behind a lamppost, and she's wearing a cape, and you can see her looking up at this townhouse, and there's the shadowy figure of a woman in an upper window. Now, another fun fact about this book cover in particular, it may look more familiar to you, and there's a reason for that. They actually recycled this book cover. It's on the Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys Super Sleuths book, Volume 1. And Nancy looks exactly the same, except she's flipped and on the right side of the book, and the Hardy Boys have been added on there as well. So I was like, I've seen this cover before. Where have I seen it? And so when I was looking on my bookshelf, I was like, oh my gosh, these look almost identical, except the Hardy Boys are on this cover too. So this book, the Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys Super Sleuths book, also came out in 1981, so I guess they just felt like recycling the artwork. I don't know. Now, the second edition of this book cover that I was able to find, it's a very purple book cover, and we have Nancy wearing this beautiful silver strapless dress and some dangly earrings. There's some snowflakes hanging in the background, and this is actually a scene from the book, and there's these 2 guys in tuxedos kind of looking on at her in a sinister sort of way. There also is a tagline on this book cover edition, and it says, Nancy receives an engraved invitation to danger. Now, the third edition of this book is the one that I have on my bookshelf. It's Nancy, and she's coming out of what looks like a house that's on fire. She's wearing the high-waisted jeans, a button-down shirt. This one looks pretty scary, actually, but the tagline for this one is, Nancy's latest case may be too hot to handle. And the fourth and final book cover hardcover edition that I was able to find online. I believe this one is a UK edition, and it's saying that this is the 57th book in the series on this edition. And Nancy, honestly, she looks like she's surrounded by paper towel dispensers, but I think they're supposed to be like Klieg lights, like Nancy's having like a fashion shoot sort of moment, which that's one thing about this book. There's a lot of high fashion. We're in New York in this book, so it's very, very cool. So I came up with some funny cover spoofs for each edition of these books. So for the first cover, where Nancy is looking up at that building and the woman is in the upper window, I just said, Nancy Drew, Neighborhood Watch. For the second cover edition, I just said The Case of the Snowflake Dance, because Nancy is just at this winter-themed ball, this like gala that goes on in the book, which is really, really cool. And for the third edition of the book covers, I came up with this funny cover spoof, Going Out in a Blaze of Glory, because Nancy's literally just running out of this flaming building. And the funny cover spoof for the fourth book cover edition is just, but first, let me take a selfie. Because Nancy has just like got the 80s permed hair, she's wearing this loose purple 80s dress, it just is giving so much right now. And as far as giving these book covers a rating, I would give the first book cover where Nancy's looking up at the building a 4 magnifying glasses. It's very cool. It's a very warm cover. The others I would just give like a 3, and the last one I would probably just give like a 1. I don't know. I never liked the UK editions for whatever reason. So now let's go ahead and jump into discussing the characters that we see in the Twin Dilemma. So we're in New York for this mystery, so of course we get to see Aunt Eloise, Eloise Drew. She's in this book. There's a man named Ted Henry. I just wrote brother in parentheses. He's the brother to Jacqueline Henry, who's a model who is at this fashion show that we see in the book. There's a woman named Marjorie Tyson, who is the co-chairwoman of this fashion benefit that's being put on. There's Richard Reese, who is a fashion designer, his wife Sheila. There's a woman named Paula Jenner. I don't have any notes on her, so she's just kind of a generic character, I guess. There's Rosalind, who is a seamstress that works for Mr. Reese, Chris Chavez, who's a photographer, Russell Kaiser, Pete Grover, there's Alan Grover, who's his cousin. There's a lot of characters in this book, so if you're having trouble keeping up, don't worry, I had the same problem. Okay, I don't know how to say this guy's name, but his first initial is T. His last name is Iannone, Iannone. He is the manager of a competing department store, Millington's, which plays into the book. There's Woody Hoskins, Frank Vanderveer, and Arnaud Hans, who's a competing designer of Mr. Reese. Also, I'm going to give you all a heads up. There are a ton of aliases in this book, and you guys know how I feel about that. Like, I can appreciate maybe one alias. This was like everyone had an alias. You get an alias and you get an alias, and this guy over here, he gets an alias, and it was just like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to keep up with all this? Like, I'm writing down notes and it's still like, it's a lot. So really quickly, I'll go ahead and read a brief synopsis for the Twin Dilemma. Aunt Eloise has a case for Nancy. A famous model has gone missing, but as soon as Nancy arrives in New York, more drama unfolds, including the news that a fashion designer's spring collection has been stolen. It's up to Nancy to solve the case. And now, for a brief newspaper headline synopsis. Shady outfit. Nancy Drew and friends uncover smuggled designer clothing scam. I like to be dramatic on this show. So now let's go ahead and jump into the direct quotes and notes that I wrote down for this book. There's quite a few. So at the beginning of the Twin Dilemma, Aunt Eloise has invited Nancy, Bess, and George to help her solve a mystery in New York, and she's co-chairing a fashion show benefit with Marjorie Tyson, and one of the models, Jacqueline Henry, has gone missing. Now, as this book does heavily center around the fashion world and the modeling industry, that is why I put a content warning for this episode. As you can imagine, because, we haven't already made fun of Bess in every other Nancy Drew book, this book, while it's not as bad as some, it does have a few things in it that I find to be a little bit problematic. And in fact, one of the second notes that I wrote down is the fact that Bess gushes about how Jacqueline Henry is bony thin. And the book says bony thin, and it's like in a complimentary way. And, everyone comes in different shapes, different sizes. The reason I found this problematic is the fact that Bess is constantly going on a diet and being made fun of by George and and sometimes other people in the books. So this just made my heart hurt for Bess. It just, I wish we could get a book where we, because I love the aspects of the fashion industry, but that is unfortunately a lot of times a part of the fashion industry, this, pressure to stay a certain size, a certain way. So that was a little bit disheartening for me to read. And if no one has told you this recently, I want you to know that you are beautiful exactly the way you are. And I just, I sometimes cringe when I have to bring up these instances of body shaming that are particularly done to Bess in this Nancy Drew series, because these are written for kids. These are written for young girls who are very impressionable at that age. And it's just, that's the part that I think bothers me the most when I see these things, when I'm reading the books for the podcast episodes. And yeah, I just want you to know, if you read these books like I did as a child and it had a negative impact on you, we're here to heal those traumas. We're here to address the things that happen in the books and to move on from them. But yeah, I hope for the sake of every little girl out there, you don't take these things that you read in these books and internalize them. So Nancy is going to try and locate Jacqueline Henry since she's missing, but Aunt Eloise tells Nancy that she can stand in to model if they can't find Jacqueline. And it's so funny to me that this always happens to Nancy. She's always just like on the sidelines, but at a moment's notice, she's like, oh yeah, I can dance this Nutcracker ballet that I have never danced before, but I will know every single step in like 5 minutes. What can I say? Nancy Drew is a quick learner, but I believe the last time that she modeled was in The Clue in the Jewel Box, maybe. She modeled for a friend of Helen Corning's, but Nancy, of course, hems and haws because she's modest, and she's like, oh no, I can't model in this New York fashion show. But then Nancy even says in the book, she's like, oh, well, Jacqueline is a professional model. She's probably much thinner than I am. And then Aunt Eloise says, no, she's really not. And Bess insists, she's like, Nancy, you've modeled before. Like, you can do this. So Nancy agrees, and she's like, okay, I'll help out, but only as a last resort if we can't find Jacqueline. So everyone gets in a taxi, and they go down to Rockefeller Center. And while they're there, Bess spots Jacqueline Henry getting into a cab and leaving. And Nancy makes the comment that it's odd that she's in town, but didn't show up or call anyone. And so she speculates that she didn't get to be a successful model through miscommunication. I mean, that's a pretty fair assumption. Usually you are considered to be good at your job if you show up on time and you do what you say you're going to do. So yeah, Jacqueline usually shows up for her engagement. She shows up for the fashion walks, and so it is a little bit odd that she is seen in the area, but she's not going to where she's supposed to be going. So at this point, Nancy and the girls meet Marjorie Tyson, who is co-chairing this fashion benefit with Aunt Eloise, and they witness Richard Reese, the famous fashion designer, throwing a full-on tantrum. So this grown man, he's saying his clothes for the show are missing, and he complains of others being on the rack of another designer whose name is Steiner, and he's just like, these aren't even supposed to be here, they're in my way, and he's just taking it out on everyone in the backstage area. And he runs headlong into Bess and George, and clothes go in every direction as he falls down. So Bess and George, Bess especially, is mortified. And then in a fit of rage, Mr. Reese fires a seamstress named Rosalind. I mean, she wasn't even doing anything. She was just standing there. I mean, she didn't get in the way. And Mr. Reese is very much like Miranda Priestley from The Devil Wears Prada. Like, at a moment's notice, he's just like, you're fired. Also kind of reminds me of Manette in the Nancy Drew computer game Danger by Design. Love that game. But what is it with people in the fashion industry having like such a short fuse? I feel like this is a bit of a stereotype. He's coming apart at the seams. So everyone's scrambling around trying to pick up these clothes while this man is just turning bright red and is furious. And Nancy tries to calm him down, and she's like, hey, Mr. Reese, I'm a detective and maybe I can help you find these dresses that are missing. I'm also here to find this missing model. But he just snaps at her and he says, and I'm the Emperor of China. Okay, sir, no, just no. But Nancy talks to him while he calms down, and he's able to confirm that 3 pieces from his spring collection were stolen. And so Mr. Reese tells Nancy, you'll do when it comes to modeling his clothes. And I'm just like, Nancy is stepping in to help you, sir. Like, do you not realize, like, you are the one that needs help here? You are missing a model who was supposed to model your clothing. You're missing the clothing itself. How about a little bit of gratitude here? But then, right after that, Mr. Reese yells for Rosalind, the seamstress that he just fired, and someone reminds him. They're like, Mr. Reese, you just fired Rosalind. She's not here anymore. And so instead of apologizing or being accountable for his actions, Mr. Reese is just like, well, everyone knows that I have a temper and Rosalind will be back. And so then some lady named Yolanda just jumps in to help Nancy get ready instead. Like, no wonder someone stole some of the pieces from your spring collection. Like, not saying that's right, but you're not exactly the easiest person to be around, okay? So Nancy walks this fashion runway and she's doing a great job when suddenly Mr. Reese comes from the wings saying he's been robbed, and he's just shouting, and everyone in the audience is like, what's going on? And he takes Nancy backstage with him and he shows her a Millington catalog, flips to a page and says someone ripped off his collection before he even got to show it publicly. So obviously Mr. Reese is very upset about this, but Nancy convinces him that the damage has been done, and she gets him to allow her to walk the show in his creations that he still has. Otherwise, it would hurt the charity the show is raising money for. I love that Nancy did this. Like, she framed it in such a way that she convinced him to let her still walk the runway, because it's like, yeah, at the end of the day, like, yeah, that's bad that you had your dresses stolen from you, your pieces that you worked so hard on, but if I don't walk the show, like, this is going to hurt more people than just you. This is going to hurt this charity. We're not going to be able to raise as much money for orphans or whatever this charity is put on to do. So Nancy walks the runway, and while she's walking down the runway, she spots Jacqueline Henry in the audience. And after the show, she goes to track her down, but she seems really nervous for some reason. It's also really odd that she didn't walk in the fashion show herself, but she still showed up to see what would happen, and she just seems on edge. And there's a page that goes over the speakers calling Jacqueline's name, and Nancy stops her before she can run off, and she asks, like, is there any way that I can help you? And Jacqueline confides in Nancy and says that she thinks her brother Ted may have been kidnapped. But before Nancy can get her to answer any more questions, Jacqueline breaks away and goes to answer the page, but later the girls can't find her and she's disappeared. So it's while Nancy's in the lobby that she gets stopped by some guy named Chris Chavez, and he asks Nancy to dance. The book says that he's in his 30s, and turns out he's a famous photographer, and he's dying to photograph Nancy, because of course he is. Like, everyone is like, oh, Nancy, you're so beautiful. But this seemed very skeevy to me. I was just like, I don't know. I feel like the older you get as a woman, you just have this red flag radar detector that just goes off. Even when I'm reading these books, I'm just like, I don't trust that guy. So Chris asks Nancy if she's done much modeling, and she says no, but her housekeeper Hannah would be thrilled if she stopped being a detective, which honestly Hannah would. She'd be like, Nancy, I would sleep so much better at night. But Chris makes no comment on this, but he does give Nancy his number so they can set up some studio time. I just hope Bess and George go with Nancy to this studio photo shoot, because I would feel so much better about it if they did. So eventually Nancy does catch up with Bess and George, and Bess says to Nancy, George and I were wondering where you went. We didn't realize you had met such a handsome man. Does he have a couple of friends? This part, I just had to take my hand and just hit myself in the forehead. Like, Bess, he is in his 30s. You are 18. Does this seem wrong to anyone else? So the next thing to happen is Nancy witnesses a man poking around backstage of the runway, and he glares at her and leaves when she confronts him and is like, what are you doing back here? And he says absolutely nothing. So Nancy reports it to the hotel's front desk, and Aunt Eloise, who says it doesn't pay to be too suspicious. I love that Aunt Eloise was saying this, like, it doesn't pay to be too suspicious. Like, the man is poking around backstage of the fashion show benefit that you are helping put on, and a designer just came out onto the runway just a few minutes ago screaming that his collection has gone missing. Like, I think we're being appropriately suspicious. So after this, Nancy Nancy gets some sketches of the missing dresses from Mr. Reese, and she tells him, she's like, this would be really helpful in my investigation if you can just sketch them out for me. If I'm able to find them, I can bring them to you. So the next day, Nancy, Bess, and George go to Chris Chavez, the photographer's studio, and they overhear him arguing with Jacqueline, the model, about her brother Ted. And Jacqueline opens up to Nancy and says Ted has done some investigative journalism and has made a lot of people unhappy. That sounds like a pretty good motive for kidnapping. But Jacqueline shows Nancy a note that she found in her mailbox, and it just says, if you don't hear from me in a few days, call the police. Don't try to contact me before then, T. And there's also a lion's crest drawn on this note. So Jacqueline also explains that her brother had last been investigating a Manhattan auction house he thought was selling costume jewelry, but trying to pass it off as the real thing. So that's an interesting tidbit of information. But strangely enough, Jacqueline and Chris tell Nancy that they think she shouldn't get involved with the case of Mr. Reese's missing dresses because it could be too dangerous. But they do want her help finding Ted, so that's apparently not too dangerous for her to do. It's just kind of odd. Like, I would think searching for a missing person would be more dangerous than searching for missing couture, but that's just me. So Nancy starts to do some investigating into Ted's disappearance, and she looks in the classifieds and finds an auction house that might be a good place to start. So she takes note of the time of the auction and writes it down, and she wonders if Ted might be there or if there may be an item with a lion on it that could be a clue. So after Nancy, Bess, and George have left the photographer's studio, Bess mysteriously parts ways from them, and when she gets back to Aunt Eloise's apartment, she's been all glammed up with tons of makeup and false eyelashes. And the book says one of the lashes is halfway up her eyelid and she looks like a Paul Klee painting. I had to look this up. He's a real artist. He kind of has a blocky kind of style to it. It's very unrealistic, kind of like Picasso, but not quite as out there. But he has a thing for crooked eyes, so that's what they were going for, I guess, when they referenced him. So Nancy and George giggle at Bess's appearance, but in true George fashion, she takes it too far, and she grabs a camera and snaps a picture saying, "Here she is, folks, the new model of the year," and she threatens to send it to Dave. I don't know, I just am not a fan of friendships like this where people pick at your appearance and make fun of you in like subtle, passive-aggressive ways. Like, yeah, Bess's eyelashes are on crooked, they probably blew halfway up her eyelid, but still, it's like a real girl's girl would just be like, hey, let me fix that for you, and oh my gosh, you look so pretty, where did you go, what did you have done, that's so great. But just Bess can't catch a break in these books, and she just wanted to look pretty. It just made me very sad, and George is just not a girl's girl. I think what makes it extra sad too is it's because Bess went to that photo shoot with George and Nancy, and of course she saw, the photographer fawning over Nancy like, oh, you're so pretty, and she probably got some advice from, I think she talked to Jacqueline after the photo shoot. So I mean, Bess she just wants to be pretty, and she is pretty. She's pretty without all of the stuff that she had done, her hair, her eyelashes, but if she wants to have that done, like, she can. There's no law saying she can't. It's just like, I don't know, the scene was just very mean-spirited to me. So Bess doesn't talk to George all through dinner, and I don't blame her, I wouldn't either, but she, George, and Nancy go to the auction house, and they see that there's a medallion with a lion crest in that night's auction. So it gets switched around in the order of items, and it later comes up. So once it's up on the auction block, Nancy tests this theory that she has, and after this rapid-fire bidding war between a few people in the audience, she places a bid for $550. And at first, Nancy panics, thinking she'll be stuck with the medallion and she doesn't have that money with her, but then one of the men bids and wins it. And the medallion was apparently formerly owned by someone named Galen Kaiser. So Nancy goes to congratulate the winner of the medallion, whose name is Russell Kaiser, but he's rude and he leaves in a hurry. And then the other bidder, who was competing against him, introduces himself to Nancy as Russell Kaiser. So he becomes alarmed when Nancy says, well, I just met this other guy named Russell Kaiser. He just left, and he signed the slip for the medallion with the name Russell Kaiser, so who is the real Russell Kaiser? And this is where those pesky aliases start to come into the plot. So this guy who's saying his name is Russell Kaiser says his uncle owned the medallion, and an old friend of his uncle's had wanted to have the medallion for sentimental reasons, but it had already gone to the auction house, so he'd been forced to bid on it. And he asks for Nancy's help finding his imposter. So now we're working on 3 mysteries. We're trying to find these missing dresses. We already kind of found a missing model, but we're trying to find her missing brother, and now we're trying to find this imposter, this fake Russell Kaiser. And Nancy is doing this all for free, I might add, so like, that's a lot. That's a lot to put on one person. Not that she can't do it, because she will, but like, this is getting really convoluted really fast. So at this point in the mystery, Nancy gets a telegram from Carson that says, "Could not reach you by phone, sending important papers today, please wait for them." So Nancy does have the forethought to be like, okay, that's a little bit odd. So she calls Hannah, but Carson has already left for the office, so she can't ask him what the papers are for. So Nancy next calls Carson's office, but his secretary says that he's out on business. So Nancy's like, okay, I guess I'm just gonna have to stay at Aunt Eloise's apartment and wait for these papers. So she does that while Bess and George go to the police office to look at mugshots and see if they can find the fake Russell Kaiser. So while they're at the police department, Bess finds a picture of this blonde man who is the second bidder who claimed to be the real Russell Kaiser. And he's not the real Russell Kaiser. He's a liar. He is actually a man named Pete Grover, and he's wanted for check forgery. Will the real Russell Kaiser please stand up, because that would make solving this mystery so much easier for Nancy. So after they find this out, Bess and George go to this chic dress shop that Jacqueline recommended, and Bess laments that you'd have to be a stick to wear any of it. And George meanly says, well, that lets you out. It's just a book. It's just a book. I'm not choosing violence today. George, what does Bird even see in you? What do your friends see in you? You're just so mean all the time. But what I did enjoy about this scene was that Bess still had fun trying things on. Even though her cousin was an absolute jerk to her, she just has a lot of fun with it, and she goes and she tries on all these outrageous outfits, and she ends up really liking this black and silver jumpsuit, and she's giggling and kind of pretending to model while George sits on the sidelines. So it's like George is over here pouting, Bess is the one having actual fun. I love Bess Marvin so much. I mean, that takes so much strength after someone has degraded you and said something really nasty to you to just be like, you know what, I'm gonna have fun, and I don't care if you do or not. Like, you can be mean all you want. I'm gonna enjoy myself here. So Bess asks George if she likes the jumpsuit that she's wearing, and George says she's a true vision. And I want more of this lighthearted joking that's not so mean-spirited. And Bess just feeling herself and having fun and being allowed to want to look cute. Like, there's nothing wrong with wanting to look nice. And I'm sure George was just being sarcastic or petty when she said, oh, you're a true vision. But what I liked was that Bess didn't let it get her down. Bess does balk a little bit at the price of the jumpsuit, though. She goes up to ask how much it is, and it's $425. And so she's like, oh, okay, maybe not today. Relatable. So the next note that I wrote down, I was apparently processing my emotions, because I said, oh yikes, this scene was bad, then tolerable, then bad again, and I thought it was almost like not so bad, but then I was quickly disappointed. So in this next scene, Bess says she's disappointed, and then George says, just think of it this way, if you had bought that outfit, Dave would have thought something had happened to the good old Bess he once knew. Besides, it would have looked better on a thinner girl. Okay, I take back everything that I said. I will choose violence today, because George, what the crap? Like, I don't understand this. Like, it's like the people writing this were like, oh, we're gonna, compliment Bess. She's beautiful without the fancy outfits and her hair being done and the eyelash extensions. But then they had to go and add that. They had to say, well, this would have looked better on someone who's smaller than you are. Like, I don't get that at all. And you know what? I can point the finger at George all I want, but it's really not even George that's the problem here. It's the people that wrote these books. Like, why did they think this was okay to put in a book that primarily young girls are going to be reading? That blows my mind, and I hope that we're in a better place today. I know we still have a lot of work to do, but that just makes me so sad. And this next part breaks my heart, but Bess says, "Good old Bess, that's me. I guess I'm just never going to be very sophisticated." As if sophistication is equated to body weight. Like, the messaging here is so out of whack. And George saying it would have looked better on someone smaller, and then saying kind of inadvertently that Bess needs to look a certain way for Dave. Like, nope, not the vibe. So to all the women listening to this podcast, young and old, I want to say to you, wear the jumpsuit, wear the false lashes, wear what you want to wear, and don't let your mean cousin, or worse, that mean voice inside your head, tell you that you aren't worthy. Forget sophisticated and let's replace that word with worthy. You are worthy. Bess Marvin is worthy. If you want to dress up or dress down, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. You are beautiful inside and out. Who would have thought that I would be dismantling so many false narratives on a Nancy Drew podcast? So the next thing to happen, big surprise, the telegram, the important papers that Nancy was waiting for Carson to send to her, that was fake. Someone just wanted to keep her at the apartment all day and keep her from snooping. But who was it and why? So Nancy and the girls go to a photography studio, another one, it's called Zanzibar's, and they hear Mr. Reese yelling at a photographer named Mr. Vinton. So Reese pushes a model, knocks over a light, and then he pulls down a backdrop. Like, this guy is an absolute menace. So Nancy tries to calm him down, as if this is her job to calm down this grown man that should know better than to behave like this. But he says the photographers who took pictures of the knockoffs of his pieces are covering for the people who stole his designs. So that's why he's mad. So Nancy asks if anyone saw the designs, like she's trying to figure out like how they could have leaked out. And Reese says he showed them to Chris Chavez, the photographer, and 3 or 4 staff members. So Nancy devises a plan, and she, Bess, and George are going to get jobs at the Millington Company, which was the catalog that had published some of Mr. Reese's stolen fashion pieces. So it's just funny because George points out that Nancy has never worked for anyone other than her dad, which, I mean, that's fair. The only other time Nancy has briefly had a job was when she worked for that art gallery in the Whispering Statue mystery. But as Nancy and the girls are leaving a restaurant, and they've devised this plan, they hear someone talking to Chris Chavez, but it's not the same man that they met. So it's another imposter, another alias. So crazy. But Bess and George go to Chalmers, which is another store, I guess, and they try and get secretary jobs. And George is horrible at typing. Like, she's using an old standard typewriter, but it just made me laugh. But they are able to find out that Chris Chavez has done photography for the company. I guess Chalmers is another fashion house. But he just got back from Europe, so he's not the original man that they met. It's an imposter. So they're able to at least confirm that. So meanwhile, Nancy gets a job as a stylist at Millington Company, and Mr. Iannone, I guess that's how you say his name, accuses Nancy of spying, and he knows that she's helping Mr. Reese. So he shows Nancy to this back room, and then the lights go out, and Nancy is locked in. So next, Bess and George try to go see Jacqueline Henry, but a man rudely answers the apartment buzzer where she's supposed to be and says she's not there. But they also hear someone say to keep Nancy busy. So they see the fake Chris Chavez leaving in a taxi, and they're not able to catch him. So Nancy, meanwhile, gets herself out of the locked room at Millington's by using a filing tab of some sort to jimmy the lock. But when she gets back to Aunt Eloise's apartment, she's met by Bess and George and Aunt Eloise, who are full of questions, so they all catch up on everything. But Bess and George propose a theory, and they're starting to wonder if Jacqueline is in on the design stealing racket. So the next morning, Bess shows Nancy a newspaper article, and Russell Kaiser's apartment was burglarized, and she wonders if the medallion was stolen and if there's a connection between Kaiser's imposter and the robbery. So next, Nancy goes back to Millington's, and she thinks she sees Rosalind, the seamstress that Mr. Reese fired a while back, but she avoids Nancy. Very suspicious. And a woman also informs Nancy that Mr. Iannone quit, and he had no authority to hire her, so she doesn't have a job there anymore. So that was very short-lived. So upon leaving Millington's, Nancy does spot Jacqueline's friend who claimed to be Chris Chavez, but isn't. So Bess and George go to investigate Kaiser's apartment, but there's cops there, so they stake out in this coffee shop across the street as it's snowing, and then George gets impatient and calls Kaiser's apartment. This mystery is all over the place. But the maid picks up at Kaiser's apartment and she says she's just going out. And Bess and George hurry out of the coffee shop in time to see this bald man. And George comes to the conclusion that the second Kaiser who asked Nancy for help was the fake. I thought we already knew that, but okay. But she thinks that he's got to be Peter Grover, the guy that they saw his picture at the police department in the mugshots. So meanwhile, Nancy has gone to a restaurant to meet Bess and George, and she witnesses the fake Chris Chavez talking to Peter Grover, the phony Russell Kaiser. Like, if your mind is just right now, you're not the only one. I'm reading this back and I'm like, how does any of this make sense? But she leaves a note with the hostess for Bess and George, and she follows the men to a fabric store called Bellini's. And while she's there, Nancy eavesdrops and overhears a name that she thinks may have been Rosalind, but she accidentally turns over this filing cabinet full of buttons, and they go all over the floor, so she has to hide. Way to go, Nancy. But they don't see her, and she overhears more about Miss Jenner, and now suspects that the fake Chris Chavez may be the reporter Ted Henry. Like, this is such a bait and switch mystery. It was like, this person is this person and now they're this person. I could not keep up. And reading these notes back, I'm like, this is all so convoluted. So meanwhile, Bess and George follow the real Mr. Kaiser to the police station, and they question him about the robbery, and he says that the medallion wasn't stolen. So when Nancy, Bess, and George finally meet up to compare their notes, they think that Ted Henry sent Nancy on a wild goose chase with the auction mystery to distract her from Mr. Reese's mystery, and they still aren't sure of Jacqueline's involvement because, remember, Jacqueline and quote-unquote Chris Chavez, who we now think is Ted Henry, they said, oh, Nancy, you don't need to get involved in this mystery with Mr. Reese. You need to find Ted Henry, Jacqueline's brother, who is actually me. It's so confusing. Also, over the course of this episode, I feel like I've said Jacqueline's name like 10 different ways. Like, how do you guys say it? Jacqueline? 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 I don't know. So anyways, name pronunciation aside, Nancy overheard at Bellini's fabric store while she was there eavesdropping that Ted Henry is going to be at some event called the Crystal Party. So she tells Bess and George that they're going to go to it. And Bess reads a newspaper article about the Crystal Party, and she exclaims that the tickets are $250 a piece, and Nancy says she thinks she has a way that they can go for free. And when I read that, I was like, of course you're going to get in there for free, Nancy Nepotism Drew. Like, Eloise is the co-chairwoman of this fashion show, so you're probably going to get into this party for free, if I had to guess. I have to say, one of my favorite tropes of the Nancy Drew universe is that Nancy has, gajillions of dollars. I mean, her father is a famous lawyer, and yet she never pays full price for anything. Like, as a thrifting queen myself, like, respect, but also, what? But I did think that it was funny that Bess joked about this. She said, okay, if we go to this party, I'll go as Lady Macaroni, and Nancy, you can be Baroness von Hootenanny. Now, these are the kind of aliases that I can get behind. So next, the girls go to visit Mr. Reese, the very angry fashion designer, and he says someone named Zoe Babbitt bought a bunch of dresses from his collection, and Nancy convinces him that they need to be at this crystal party to investigate, but they don't have anything to wear. Quick, cue the early 2000s movie-style makeover montage. Now, I know this book came out in the 1980s, but who doesn't love a good Cinderella-like moment? They need dresses. This guy's a fashion designer. It's a match made in heaven. So Mr. Reese is like, okay, I'll set you up with some haute couture, and he calls someone in, and it's none other than Rosalind, his assistant that he fired, so she's back working for him now. This is kind of suspicious because didn't Nancy think that she saw her at the Millington Company's offices not too long ago? But Nancy asks him if he hired her back, and Mr. Reese says he didn't beg her to come back, she just came back on her own. There's also this weird interaction where Rosalind brings Nancy and the girls these dresses that are too small for them. It's kind of like she's trying to sabotage and get them to not go to the crystal party, but she sticks them with pins, and then when Mr. Reese affectionately calls the girls his detectives, Rosalind seems to get really nervous about this and spills pins everywhere. So before the crystal party, the girls are sent the dresses that they were fitted for, but someone deliberately sewed the zippers shut. So they have to slowly cut them open without damaging the dresses themselves. So someone, Rosalind or otherwise, really doesn't want them to go to this party. But the girls do finally make it to the crystal party with Mr. Reese wearing his designs, but he intentionally snubs this other man who turns out to be named Arnaud Hans, and Nancy realizes that's the same name of the designer who had his name under Mr. Reese's designs in the Chalmers catalog. So this is the guy who, whether he knew it or not, he was claiming to have designed these things that Mr. Reese actually designed. Scandalous. But Mr. Hans insists that he didn't steal the designs, and he doubts Millington did either. He says Reese is just losing his touch. Ouch. So next, Nancy finds Pete Grover, the guy who was impersonating Mr. Kaiser. This is so complicated. And George says they heard about the burglary at his apartment, and he has to catch himself. He says, "Oh, of course, that burglary." And he makes up an excuse and hurries away. Because, of course, it's not really his apartment. And he had to be like, "Oh, yeah, my apartment got robbed. Yeah, that was mine, not some other guys that I'm impersonating currently." So right after this, Nancy sees Pete Grover, the guy we just encountered, talking to Ted Henry, and they say something about Gramercy Park and 11. And so on a hunch, she's like, "I think they're going to 11 Gramercy Park." So she gets a cab and goes there, and when she gets there, she sees a shadow in an upper window, and it's Rosalind. Something's about to go down. But then Nancy also sees Bellini, the fabric store owner, show up, and there's a van, which he goes over to. And when he goes up to the apartment where Rosalind is, Nancy goes over to the van and sees racks of stolen dresses. But before she can do anything about it, Bellini comes back out, and Nancy has to hop in the van and hide behind the racks of dresses. So meanwhile, back at the dance, Bess is dancing with this guy named Woody Hoskins, and George is dancing with someone named Frank Vanderveer. These two men who say their parents are in the clothing business, which is just vague enough to maybe seem believable. So they're making small talk, and Bess tells them they're from River Heights, home of Detective Nancy Drew, like Nancy's a landmark or something. It's just funny because she's just like, "Yeah, River Heights, that's home of Nancy Drew." And no surprises, they've heard of her. But Bess also tells them they're amateur detectives, and about this time, Bess and George realize they haven't seen Nancy in a while. So Woody and Frank are very reluctant to let Bess and George leave. They're like, "No, we're having so much fun, let's keep dancing." But then Bess is like, "No, we need to go look for Nancy," so they offer to help. So first they go to the cloakroom to see if Nancy's coat is gone, and it is, and the coat check girl passes along a note that Nancy left for them detailing where she was going. So she wrote down, "Hey guys, I'm going to 11 Gramercy Park. If I don't come back soon, go get the cops or something." So this, though, I was like, bravo, Nancy, thank you for at least leaving a note, because most of the time you just take off and do things on your own and you get in trouble. So Bess, George, Frank, and Woody go to 11 Gramercy Park, and they find one of Nancy's earrings crushed on the ground on the sidewalk. And about that time, a window opens up above, and someone says, "I believe the girl you are looking for is here." And George notes that it sounds a lot like Rosalind's voice, but I don't know about you. I don't care. I mean, I think Gramercy Park is supposed to be a pretty good area of New York. I'm not going to go up to an apartment where somebody just yells out the window like, "Hey, I think that the person you're looking for is up here." Like, that just, how do you know who I'm looking for? How do you know what I'm even doing here? But of course, Bess and George go upstairs to investigate, and they get locked in a closet, and they were double-crossed by Frank and Woody. Now, honestly, I did kind of question why these two guys wanted to make themselves so helpful to Bess and George, but it's about 50-50 odds in Nancy Drew books. When clean-cut young men in their early 20s show up, they're either just going to be really nice and helpful, or they're the villains in disguise and they're going to double-cross you. I don't make the rules. But Woody and Frank talk about needing to get rid of the third one, so they're talking about Nancy when they say this, but she was found in the van, and Rosie, or Rosalind, wanting them to meet her at the pier. So the men leave, and they're convinced that Bess and George are locked in, and there's no way out. Well, the joke's on them, because Bess Marvin and George Fane are an unstoppable duo. So the book says George throws herself against the door several times, then Bess gives it a try, and she weakens the door, and they get out. But Bess says something here, and I'm just like, oh, Bess, no. Bess says, "I knew these few extra pounds would come in handy someday." I would like to edit this so badly and say the cousins' joint determination together got them out. Like, could we not have just put that in the book. That would have been so much nicer. George does take this moment to compliment her, though, and tells Bess that she's fabulous, which she is. Thank you for finally realizing this, George. I'm sorry that it took you guys being locked in a closet together to figure this out. So Bess and George hail a cab, and the driver is understandably very wary of taking them to these docks. I mean, it sounds like a spooky place, probably abandoned warehouses and stuff, and just sounds like a seedy underworld place you don't want to be going to late at night. But they convince him to take them there, and George says on the way that she thought about going to the police but didn't think they'd believe two kooky teenagers. I love Bess's response to this, though. She looks down at herself. She's wearing this taffeta dress, and she says, "I think we look rather sophisticated." So when they get to the docks, the taxi driver says he'll wait for them, and about that time, George spots a van. You can tell that the taxi driver is really spooked about the whole situation, though, but he has a moral conflict. He's like, I can't leave these two girls alone at this abandoned pier, but he doesn't fully believe their "our friend was kidnapped" story either. So he agrees to wait for them, and Bess and George sneak into the warehouse and see hundreds of dresses, including the one that Nancy wore to the party that night. It has a smudge of her makeup on it. But while the girls are walking through the warehouse, they must be making too much noise because Woody and Frank show up saying they heard something. So Bess and George hide under some cartons. So once the villains are satisfied that no one is in the warehouse, to their knowledge, they leave, and Bess is told by George to lose her crinoline slip under her dress because it's making too much noise. You know, as someone who has worn crinoline under mostly Halloween costumes, like, it is very cumbersome and very annoying. It would probably slow down your sleuthing. So Bess and George finally make their way to this windowless room, and they find Nancy in a cotton dress tied up, but they hear footsteps. And who comes into the room but Rosalind? But this is where it gets awesome. Bess and George tackle her and cover her mouth so she can't scream. I mean, Rosalind did it to Nancy, so it's fair game as far as I'm concerned, but I love when Bess and George team up together, like when they got out of the closet, when they did this, but Bess sits on top of Rosalind's legs so she can't get away, while George unties Nancy. So George then explains how they were double-crossed by their dates to Nancy, and she says Woody was nice and handsome and had a touch of gray in his hair, even though he was in his 20s. At first, I was like, why on earth is George mentioning this detail? It was kind of weird. It would be like someone saying, well, that person assaulted me, but they had a fantastic mustache. But the reason that George mentioned this is so Nancy could have kind of an aha, like, light bulb moment, and she realizes that this guy, Woody, was the same person that she saw sneaking into the dressing room at the fashion show earlier in the book. So meanwhile, Ted Henry, which is Jacqueline's brother, and Pete Grover have followed Bellini, the fabric store owner, and some other person to a diner, and Ted and Pete get a booth near them, and the other man that's with Bellini is Iannone, the guy who hired Nancy at Millington. So Ted and Pete overhear Iannone and Bellini, and Iannone says he was working deals with Millington and says he had to quit because Rosalind locked Nancy in and caused the blackout, and it made him look too suspicious. We also hear in this part of the book, because Nancy, Bess, and George are still back at the pier as this is going on, but we hear Ted talking about how Jackie was kidnapped and escaped, and he was looking for a story and didn't want Nancy in the way, so he sent her off on a wild goose chase. So when Ted was posing as Chris Chavez, the photographer, when him and Jackie were at the photo studio and taking pictures of Nancy for like modeling purposes, he was trying to mislead Nancy. He was trying to get her to focus on this medallion mystery so he could do his journalism stuff and not be interfered with. It's kind of convoluted, so I'm trying to explain it as best as I can. So meanwhile, back in the warehouse, the girls hear Frank and Woody approaching the room where they have Rosalind tied up, but then they get scared when they hear police sirens. So Frank and Woody take off and they lock Nancy, Bess, and George, and Rosalind in the room while the warehouse is on fire. So Nancy starts seeing smoke coming under the door, but Rosalind motions to the wall behind these overalls that are hanging there, and Nancy finds a key, and they're able to get out of the burning warehouse just as firemen begin spraying the flames. So after all this, Nancy talks to Ted Henry, who turns out to be a reporter, and Pete Grover, who actually turns out to be Alan Grover, Pete's cousin. It's so, yeah, if you need help with this one, I don't blame you. I had to write down so many people's names and be like, okay, this person is this person, who's actually this person. But Alan Grover works in the clothing industry and is not wanted by the law, which is what we thought earlier in the story, but they look incredibly alike, and Nancy apologizes, to which Alan says, "A pretty girl like you can make a crook out of me any day." So what's super funny about this is we've got all these firemen putting out the flames on the burning warehouse, and then Nancy and her friends are talking to Ted Henry like we're all wrapping up this mystery. Meanwhile, the taxi driver, who was nice enough to wait for Bess and George this entire time, he comes up to everybody and he's like, "The meter's still running and nobody's even thanked me for calling the police." I think New York taxi drivers are some of the best people, like they go above and beyond. So at this point, Nancy asks Rosalind why she also stole Mr. Reese's designs, and she says it was in retaliation for him firing her sister, Paula Jenner. And it turns out, according to Carson, the medallion that was sold at the auction concealed a very valuable opal inside of it. And that's the end of this book. It was quite a book. Now let's go on to the segment of this podcast that I like to call What's Cooking. So for this book, I saw mentionings of scrambled eggs, grapefruit juice and toast, and salad. Now for a few things that I think that Nancy could add to her resume. Really, the only thing that I said that Nancy could add to her resume for this book is model, but I have actually already said that. There was another book where Nancy did model for a friend, and that was The Clue in the Jewel Box, which is an earlier book in the original 56 series. Now let's talk about some of the things I liked and didn't like about the twin dilemma. The things I liked, I loved the fashion setting. I loved New York. I loved getting to see Aunt Eloise, but the things I didn't like, and you all know how I feel about this, is the aliases. I don't know, I just feel like in books especially, it's so much harder to get across like this person is pretending to be this other person, and then when you keep adding multiple aliases on top of one or two, it just really complicates matters for me. Also, this kind of goes without saying, but I hated the body shaming that Bess had to endure in this book. It was absolutely awful. So if I had to give the twin dilemma a magnifying glass rating, I would probably give it a 1. It was not my favorite. I really wanted to like the New York setting and the fashion industry, but the endless aliases really bumped this book down for me. So that concludes today's episode for the Twin Dilemma. Next week's episode, we're going to be talking about Captive Witness, book number 64 in the Nancy Drew series. So if you like American propaganda against Eastern European countries, no really, there's some interesting things in this book, and James Bond-esque villains, then you're definitely not going to want to miss this episode. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.